Hello seniors, today I'm going to talk about 1945 and I am recording this video in front of a live studio audience.
Yeah.
That's awesome. All right, so let's talk about the situation in 1945. So the initial focus of the US military during 1945 was to do two things: to fight against Germany primarily, but also to negotiate with Britain and the Soviet Union to figure out how the post-war world should look like. And the reality was, by 1945, the Soviet Union had done the bulk of the fighting, that they had borne the brunt of Germany's military offensive in 42 and 43. Their argument was they needed to have the bulk of the spoils, so to speak. They should be given diplomatic favor versus Britain and the United States because they had done most of the fighting. The Soviet Union was attempting to take over Eastern Europe as a buffer zone to prevent any future German attack. The Soviet Union had been attacked by Germany twice in the 20th century, once in World War I, the second time in World War II, and they wanted to avoid this happening a third time. Their solution was to take control of Poland, Czechoslovakia, most of Eastern Europe in order to prevent Germany from attacking again, or at least delaying the attack into Russia. At the same time, the United Nations is pushing for a setup called the United Nations that would be a replacement for the League of Nations, which really had not worked to stop World War II. And this would be an approach known as collective security. So you have very, very different war aims and very different focus points for diplomacy in 1945. From the United States perspective, they wanted a system called collective security, where countries work together to promote their security. The goal was to replace the League of Nations. The League of Nations had started in the aftermath of World War I in 1920, and it was an attempt at getting countries to work together to negotiate peaceful solutions before conflict actually happened. The problem was that the US never ratified the League of Nations, and so it didn't actually go into effect. It went into effect, but the US wasn't a part of it. The result was it wasn't very effective. So the United Nations was another attempt to create an organization to negotiate conflict resolution before you have actual fighting going on. You see this picture on the left, you have Eleanor Roosevelt, and she's sitting here with the person who at the time was the Secretary of War, John Foster Dulles. And this is after the UN starts, but Eleanor Roosevelt was influential in the beginning of the United Nations. She was chosen as the initial US representative to represent the United States in the United Nations. She was there in San Francisco when the organization was first started, and was very much a believer in the idea that countries should negotiate problems as opposed to fight over them. So there was a treaty signed in the spring of 45, in April of 45, in San Francisco, and they have 50 of the allies meet together in San Francisco and agree to come up with this organization called the United Nations. It ends up going into effect after 5 key countries, after the 5 main allies, which are the US, Britain, France, Russia, and China, after they all ratified the treaty. So the UN starts in October of 45. And the structure of the United Nations was created to solve some of the problems with the League of Nations. The League of Nations was very difficult to get to act because you had to get everyone involved in order to take any action, and they didn't really have any enforcement measures. So the United Nations has a couple different parts to it. It has a General Assembly, which is made up of every member country that is involved in the United Nations. And then it has a Security Council, of which there are 15 countries involved, 5 of which are permanent members of the Security Council. And those are the 5 main allies: the US, Britain, France, Russia, and China, and then 10 other countries that rotate on 3-year terms. The Security Council is the decision-making body for most of the United Nations, and in order to get buy-in, especially from the Soviet Union, the agreement was to have the permanent members of the Security Council have veto power, that they could prevent an action single-handedly in the Security Council. So that's the US-led diplomatic approach to the end of the war. The Allies meet initially the three leaders of the Allies. You see in this picture here, you have Churchill on the left, you have FDR in the center, and Stalin on the right. And they meet in Yalta, which is in Crimea. It's in the same area that's in the news right now, being potentially invaded by the not Soviet Union, by Russia. But the big three meet in Yalta in February, and they agree to let the Soviet Union control Eastern Europe at the end of the war. So the focal point is going to be how to resolve the questions of what to do with Germany, what to do with areas like Poland, what to do potentially with Japanese territory at the end of the war. They agree that Germany should be divided into 4 zones. The Western Allies will control half of Germany. This is what's going to become West Germany. So that's the US, Britain, and France. And then Russia will control the area that becomes East Germany. This is how we have this split into West Germany and East Germany. The Soviet Union also agrees to enter the war with Japan 3 months after Germany surrenders. And so there's a delay where the US is fighting against Japan. The Soviet Union is going to go in August of 1945, and that would be a quicker way to end the war because you'd have much more ability to fight. At the same time, right after this conference, FDR passes away and Roosevelt takes over. So this is the last conference where you have all 3 of the original powers fighting in the war. So in terms of the war in Europe, the fighting is relatively quick in that you have the D-Day invasion I've already talked about, and then in April, the US and Russian forces had met and really, by this time, had surrounded Germany, and you have the Western Allies moving through France into Germany. You have the Soviet Union following these green lines, moving from the east into Germany, and they meet and they end up dividing up Germany. Germany surrenders on May 7th, 1945. There's one last meeting that goes on towards the end of the war. This is after the war in Europe ends. Well, the war against Japan is still going on, and the meeting is in Potsdam, which is outside of Berlin in Germany. It starts on July 17th and ends on August 7th. I point out the date because this is going on at the exact same time that the atomic test is going on in New Mexico. So the Potsdam Conference is the final World War II conference of the Allies. By this time, you have, as you see in the picture, Stalin is still there, but FDR has passed away by this time, and Harry Truman has become president. Harry Truman is in the gray suit in the center, right here. And Winston Churchill was there at the beginning of the conference, but he loses re-election in the parliament during the time he's at the Potsdam Conference. So he is replaced as prime minister during the middle of the conference. And that's today's awkwardness for this video. The big topic that goes on has to do with Germany. They talk mostly about Germany, but really, behind the scenes, the major issue of historical significance has to do with the atomic test. And Truman gets word of the atomic test on the first day of the conference and is very much encouraged by this news, and they had really decided by this point to use the atomic bomb against Japan to end the war. He tells Stalin about a week into the conference about a new weapon that would totally devastate Japan. And he uses vague language. He doesn't call it an atomic bomb. He doesn't talk about fission, but he does mention a new weapon. And Stalin just kind of listens and says, okay. And it's interesting because Truman, his response at the time really felt maybe that Stalin just didn't understand what Truman was saying and didn't understand the enormity of the weapon they had. In reality, we know now that Stalin actually had spies in Los Alamos in New Mexico, and he had heard about the atomic program already, knew there was an atomic bomb, so this was not news to him, and so he's like, okay, fine, I already know that. The reason I point all this out is because the decision to use the atomic bomb is not an isolated incident in the sense that it's just a question of whether or not the US should use the bomb against Japan. The question of the US using the bomb against Japan exists in a bigger context of diplomatic negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union over post-war Europe and really the entirety of the post-war world. And so that's going to be the main topic we focus on Friday, is why the US used the atomic bomb and whether or not the atomic bomb was actually the first act of what we would now call the Cold War. Have a good day. Thank you for my studio audience for cheering. I will see you guys all soon. Go team.